Before we go any further, viewer discretion is strongly advised. What you are about to hear is presented strictly for entertainment purposes, yet the events that unfold blur the line between scripted television and raw, unscripted confrontation. This is the story of what happens when one of the most powerful figures in global entertainment steps into what should have been a safe, familiar arena, a late-night talk show, only to discover that the host has carefully engineered a moment designed to undermine her. What followed, however, was not the humiliation the host anticipated, but a spectacular reversal that would leave audiences stunned and the very foundations of late-night television shaken. This was not merely a celebrity interview that went wrong. This was a calculated attempt at provocation that backfired with astonishing force. On that night, viewers witnessed Jennifer Lopez systematically dismantled Jimmy Kimmel on his own stage, on his own terms, and in front of his own audience. It was a masterclass in composure, power, and strategic restraint. A tactical clinic, if you will, on how to neutralize a contemptuous host who mistakenly believed he could chip away at a legacy that had been built over decades. The spectacle that unfolded was not loud or chaotic. There were no raised voices, no dramatic walk-offs, no viral tantrums. Instead, it was subtle, controlled, and devastating in its precision. And by the time it ended, many viewers would never look at late-night television the same way again. From the very moment Jennifer Lopez stepped onto the Jimmy Kimmel Live stage, something felt profoundly off. The usual electric buzz that accompanies a major celebrity appearance was replaced by a cold, almost suffocating tension. The air itself seemed heavier, as though the studio knew what was coming before the audience consciously realized it. Smiles were present, applause was loud, yet beneath it all lingered an unspoken warning. This was not going to be a routine interview. Jimmy Kimmel sat behind his desk, wearing that familiar smirk audiences had come to recognize over the years. It was the grin of a man who believed he was in complete control of the room, the conversation, and the narrative. His posture suggested confidence, but also something else, anticipation, as if he had prepared something special, something sharp, something designed to catch his guest off guard. What Jimmy failed to account for was the simple truth that Jennifer Lopez had survived far worse than a late-night talk show host with cue cards and a punchline. She had navigated an industry notorious for its cruelty, sexism, and relentless scrutiny. She had endured decades of public judgment, media mockery, and cultural dismissal, yet emerged not only intact, but dominant. When Jimmy finally introduced her, Jennifer Lopez, everyone, his voice boomed across the studio as the applause swelled and then gradually faded. But even in his tone, there was an unmistakable edge. This was not the warm, respectful welcome his production team had reportedly promised. This was the opening move. "It's wonderful to have you here, Jennifer," he said, pausing just long enough to create discomfort. Then came the hook, "Or is it J? Lo, are we still in that chapter, or have we moved on?" On the surface, it sounded harmless, playful even, but anyone familiar with the dynamics of celebrity interviews could sense the trap embedded within the question. It wasn't about a nickname. It was about diminishing identity, trivializing a career, and subtly reframing a global icon as a passing phase. Jennifer's expression did not change dramatically. There was no visible irritation, no defensive laughter. Instead, her gaze sharpened ever so slightly, a telltale sign of recognition. She knew exactly what this was. She had smelled baited traps like this her entire career. "Jennifer is fine," she replied calmly. Her voice was steady, measured, and cool, like a river of ice flowing without resistance. As she settled into her seat, her posture was composed, regal even. There was a stillness about her, the kind that comes not from uncertainty, but from absolute control. This was not a woman bracing for impact. This was a monarch who had stared down empires far larger than a late-night desk. "Jennifer it is," Jimmy echoed, shuffling his note cards in what felt like an unnecessary, almost theatrical gesture. The movement betrayed him. It was a cracks, small but visible, a moment where the illusion of control wavered. What unfolded next would not be defined by insults or overt confrontation, but by something far more unsettling. Jennifer Lopez refusing to play the role that had been written for her. Every attempt to steer the conversation toward mockery, irony, or passive aggression was met not with defensiveness, but with clarity, confidence, and an unshakable sense of self. The audience felt it. You could sense the shift as laughter became hesitant, applause more restrained. The power dynamic in the room was changing, and it was no longer flowing from behind the desk. Jimmy's carefully constructed smirk began to lose its sharpness, his questions growing less pointed, less certain. By the end of the segment, the trap had fully collapsed. The legacy Jimmy may have hoped to tarnish remained untouched, perhaps even strengthened, and in its place stood a quiet reminder of an uncomfortable truth. When respect is withheld, power reveals itself. What viewers witnessed that night was not humiliation, but exposure, not chaos, but control. And in that silent exchange between host and guest, the rules of late-night television were rewritten, if only for a moment. So I must ask, because the world is clamoring to know, and if I'm being honest, so am I. Jimmy leaned forward slightly in his chair, fingers interlaced, his smile practiced and smooth. It's been quite a turbulent year for you, hasn't it? A whirlwind of projects, major shifts in your personal life, and of course, that social media tempest that seemed to fuel a global conversation overnight. For anyone watching from the outside, it all feels rather dizzying. Jennifer tilted her head at the remark, a gesture so subtle it could have been mistaken for nothing at all. A phantom smile brushed her lips, polite, controlled, and distant, but it never reached her eyes. Those eyes, sharp and unreadable, held steady on Jimmy. "It's been a fruitful year, Jimmy," she said calmly. "I'm profoundly thankful for every opportunity I've had to build, to perform, and to feel the energy of my audience. That is the truth of my world. Of course, of course." Jimmy conceded quickly, nodding as though satisfied, but something shifted behind his expression. A hunter's glint emerged in his eyes, faint but unmistakable. "But perhaps we can explore a few of those connections, shall we? Because whispers have become stories, and stories, well, they've grown quite loud." A murmur rippled faintly through the audience. "Stories," Jimmy continued, his voice now measured and deliberate, "of imperious conduct on film sets. Stories of impossible demands placed upon your staff. Stories that paint a picture of, let's say, someone who may not be the most pleasant collaborator." The studio seemed to lose its oxygen. The laughter evaporated. Even the band sat frozen, instruments idle. This was no longer light-hearted ribbing, no playful celebrity teasing. This was a calculated maneuver, a public, on-air attempt to dismantle one of the most formidable artists on the planet. Jennifer felt it immediately, the shift in gravity, the collective intake of breath from everyone in the room. Her spine straightened, posture sharpening, as if forged from steel. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the unshakable authority of a woman who had built her empire piece by piece, without permission and without apology. "Jimmy," she said evenly, "it seems there's a disconnect here." Jimmy opened his mouth, but she continued before he could interrupt. "Are you inquiring about my professional commitment, my work ethic?" Her gaze never wavered, "because if that's the case, I would be delighted to discuss it." She paused, not for effect, but with intention. "I have dedicated over 3 decades to this industry. I have forged my entire career on a foundation of discipline, relentless dedication, and absolute respect for every person I collaborate with, from the lead actors to the newest production assistants. If you have a legitimate question about my work, I will answer it honestly and openly." The silence in the studio became oppressive, but Jennifer added, her tone cooling further, "If your intention is to launder gossip from tabloids under the guise of curiosity, then perhaps the more interesting conversation is about why you feel the need to do so." For the briefest moment, Jimmy's smirk cracked. The polished host persona faltered, just enough for the cameras to catch it. He scrambled for his next line, chuckling nervously. "Oh, Jennifer, let's not be so grim," he said, waving a hand as though dismissing the tension. "A bit of harmless banter, a little friendly fire." The audience remained silent. "You know how these things go," he continued. "The stories, the writers, the diva demands, it's all part of the mythology. Surely after all this time, you can see the humor in the narrative that's been built around you. The tantrums," the Jennifer raised her hand slightly. He stopped mid-sentence. What followed was not a question. It was the calm before a storm. A stillness settled over the room. dense and electric. Jennifer leaned forward just enough to signal that something irreversible was about to be said. There is nothing humorous about diminishing professionalism by disguising it as temperament, she said quietly. There is nothing amusing about labeling a woman difficult when she asks for the same standards of excellence that men are praised for demanding. Her words were measured, but they landed with precision. I do not throw tantrums, she continued. I set boundaries. I do not make impossible demands. I insist on preparation, safety, and respect. If that makes me inconvenient to outdated expectations, then I wear that inconvenience proudly. Jimmy swallowed. The industry loves to romanticize chaos, Jennifer said, her voice unwavering. But I built my career on consistency, on showing up early, on knowing my craft, on refusing to shrink so others could feel more comfortable. She sat back slightly, eyes never leaving his. So no, Jimmy, she concluded. This isn't banter. This is a test, and I believe the audience is intelligent enough to see exactly who it's meant to serve. The studio erupted, not with laughter, but with applause. Slow at first, then thunderous. Jimmy forced a smile, nodding as though the moment had unfolded exactly as planned, but the damage was done. The narrative had shifted, and everyone in the room knew it. Jennifer crossed her legs calmly, composed and unshaken. The storm had passed, and she had not moved an inch. The studio was saturated with dread, thick and unmistakable, as though the air itself had grown heavier. The playful glow of late night entertainment had vanished, replaced by something raw and unfiltered. Jimmy, Jennifer said at last, her tone calm but edged with something dangerous, I have a question for you. The room froze. When a man in this industry outlines his requirements to perform, to be comfortable, to excel, to execute his job at the absolute peak of his abilities, what term do you use? Jimmy blinked. The lights felt suddenly hotter, more invasive. A bead of sweat formed at his temple, catching him off guard. He cleared his throat, buying time. I don't know, he said finally, forcing a shrug. Professionalism. Precisely, Jennifer confirmed. Her posture shifted then, subtle, deliberate. She leaned forward, not aggressively, but with the unmistakable focus of a predator who had decided it was time to stop circling. Her gaze locked onto him, unwavering. But when a female action star, she continued, and let's be very clear here, a Latina woman, holds herself to that exact same standard, she's not described as professional. She paused, letting the silence stretch. She's called difficult, she's labeled ungrateful, she's accused of throwing tantrums. A murmur rippled through the audience, so I have to wonder, Jimmy, Jennifer said, her voice smooth but unyielding, where do your own contractual demands fall on that spectrum? Jimmy shifted in his chair. Because I have a feeling, she went on, that your dressing room, your schedule, your travel accommodations, and your ironclad creative control over this very program didn't materialize without a few requirements of your own. She gestured lightly around the studio. And yet no one calls you temperamental for insisting on them. A hush fell over the audience, a collective intake of breath. This was no longer an interview. This was a reckoning. Jimmy let out a laugh, but it echoed hollowly, brittle and thin. It was the sound of a man grasping for control that was already slipping through his fingers. Well, I mean, he sputtered, that's different, that's just, you know, standard for television, standard for you, Jennifer corrected immediately. Her voice was silk wrapped around steel, but a tantrum for me, she continued. One has to wonder about the mechanics of that distinction, don't you think? Jimmy's eyes flicked off. Camera, a silent plea to the producers, the teleprompter, anyone who could offer an escape route. None came, and the onslaught was far from over. Jennifer had endured decades of men just like him. Men who believed they could shrink her legacy with carefully planted doubts. Men who relied on manufactured drama and lazy, sexist tropes to undermine women, who refused to soften themselves for comfort. She straightened slightly, her presence filling the room. The part I find most fascinating, Jimmy, she declared, her voice now resonant with a new authority, is that you invited me onto this stage. The audience leaned in. And instead of discussing my work, the music, the films, the businesses I've built from the ground up, instead of acknowledging a career that has defied an industry notorious for discarding women once they pass 30, You chose to trade in whispers. Her eyes narrowed. You chose to breathe life into tired rumors, into second-hand accusations, into narratives that have been weaponized against women for generations. She gestured toward him, not accusingly, but pointedly. You didn't ask about the millions of hours my teams have worked. You didn't ask about the young artists I've mentored. You didn't ask about the risks I took when studios told me no, or about the doors I kicked open when they refused to unlock them. Her voice never rose, yet it commanded the room. You asked about gossip. Jimmy attempted another smile, but it faltered, and that, Jennifer said, is revealing. She paused, allowing the words to sink in. This industry loves to pretend it values excellence, she continued, but what it truly values is compliance, and when a woman refuses to comply, when she demands fairness, preparation, and respect, she is punished with character assassination. The audience was completely silent now. I am not difficult, Jennifer said evenly. I am exacting, I am prepared, I am accountable, and I expect the same from the people I work with. She leaned back, composed, unshaken. If that makes me inconvenient. She added, then I suggest the inconvenience lies not with me, but with a system that still struggles to see women, especially women of color, as authority figures in their own right. Jimmy swallowed hard. So let's be honest, Jennifer concluded. This conversation was never about my behavior. It was about comfort, yours, the industry's, and the discomfort that arises when a woman refuses to be smaller than her accomplishments. A beat passed. Then another, and finally the audience erupted, not into laughter but applause, slow at first, then swelling into something thunderous and undeniable. Jimmy nodded stiffly, forcing a grin as the cameras rolled on. But the moment had escaped him, the narrative had shifted, and everyone in the studio knew it. Jennifer sat calmly under the lights, her expression serene. The reckoning was complete, and she had never raised her voice once. You want to paint me as the monster in a fairy tale written by people who wouldn't recognize me if they tripped over me. The words landed with a force that stunned the room. This was no emotional outburst, no celebrity defensiveness. It was calculated, deliberate, and devastating. Jimmy Kimmel sensed it immediately. The momentum had shifted, and for the first time that night, he was no longer the one steering the conversation. He saw an opening, or at least what he hoped was one, a fleeting chance to stop the bleeding before the entire segment spiraled beyond his control. Jennifer, I think you're taking this the wrong way, he said, forcing a measured tone, the practiced voice of a host attempting to reassert dominance. Was I? Her reply sliced through his defense with surgical precision. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Just clarity. No, Jimmy, I am taking this exactly the right way. The audience froze. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, charged, almost suffocating. Jennifer leaned forward slightly, not in aggression, but in authority. I believe you walked onto this set tonight with a game plan, she continued. I believe you decided that this was your night, the night you would try to corner Jennifer Lopez on live television, the night you thought you could frame me, define me, and reduce me to something convenient for your punchlines. Jimmy's expression faltered, just for a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but the cameras caught it. The one variable you failed to account for, Jennifer said, her voice unwavering, is that I did not build this life by allowing men like you to write my story for me. The camera zoomed in on Jimmy, its unflinching eye capturing what the audience could now sense, a collapse in real time. His confident posture slackened. The smirk that once lived comfortably on his face dissolved into something closer to disbelief. This was no longer an interview, it was an implosion. What was happening went far beyond a celebrity defending herself. This was a masterclass in deconstruction. Jennifer Lopez wasn't merely responding, she was dismantling the very framework of his attack, stripping it down piece by painful piece. Every word she spoke carried the precision of someone shaped by decades of being underestimated, dismissed, and caricatured. The silence in the studio became a physical presence, draping itself over the audience like a heavy shroud. Laughter was gone. Applause was unthinkable. Jimmy Kimmel, seated behind the symbolic fortress of his desk, watched his carefully cultivated persona crumble under the sheer weight of her truth. But hubris has a way of convincing people they can still win even when the board is lost. And in a fatal miscalculation, Jimmy chose to double down. Look, Jennifer, he began, His voice strained, like a captain foolishly attempting to steer a broken ship back into a hurricane. "I think you're being a little oversensitive. It's comedy. It's entertainment. People want the real story, not some polished press release version of your life." The word hung in the air, oversensitive. A dangerous glint ignited in Jennifer's eyes, not anger, but recognition. Oversensitive, she repeated slowly, tasting the word, as if it were a poison she had long since developed immunity to. "Jimmy, you want to talk about what's real. Let me tell you what's real." She paused, allowing the weight of what was coming to settle. "What's real is the scoreboard," she said. "Over 70 million records sold worldwide. What's real are the films that have commanded more than $3 billion at the global box office. What's real is the empire I built, a dynasty forged in music, film, fashion, and fragrance." Each statistic landed like a gavel. "And yet," she continued, "you want to sit there and ask whether I'm oversensitive." A hollow laugh attempted to escape Jimmy's lips, but it died in his throat as Jennifer pressed forward, relentless now. "Do you want to know what else is real, Jimmy?" she asked. "The fact that you just used the word oversensitive to diagnose a woman who simply pointed out your unprofessional conduct. That's what's real. That's the headline." The audience stirred. A murmur rippled through the studio, a tide quietly, unmistakably turning against its host. "This," Jennifer said, gesturing subtly toward him, "is a late-night kingpin who believed he could corner a guest, only to find himself checkmated when she refused to be a pawn." The transfer of power was no longer subtle. It was a shockwave. "Now wait just a minute," Jimmy interjected, his voice cracking under the strain. "I'm not bullying anyone. I'm doing my job. This is the nature of late-night television. We ask the hard questions. We spar with our guests. But Jennifer cut through his justification instantly, her voice sharp as a blade. "Jimmy, there is no we in this arena," she said. "You are the one who made the decision to ambush a guest who came here in good faith. You were the one who chose to peddle damaging stereotypes instead of hosting a conversation." She sat back, composed, controlled, victorious. "And the difference between us," she concluded, "is that when you tried to turn me into a story, I reminded you that I am the author." The studio remained silent. Late-night television had just been exposed, not with shouting, not with chaos, but with truth. "Do not mistake this for a meaningful conversation," Jennifer said coldly, "and do not dare pull your entire industry into the hole you've dug for yourself." Jimmy's face flushed rapidly, the color rising like a tide of crimson beneath the harsh studio lights. Offstage, his producers were waving frantically, "Cut it, move on, abort." But Jimmy was already lost in the storm of his own making. The momentum he had tried to manufacture was now dragging him under. "Jennifer, you're twisting this into something it's not," he protested, forcing a brittle laugh. "Seriously, come on. You have to concede that some of the narratives about your conduct, some of the things that have been reported by whom?" Jennifer's interruption cracked through the studio like a whip. She leaned forward, slow and deliberate, a predator closing the distance. "Name them, Jimmy." Her voice dropped, sharpened. "If you are going to sit on this national stage and implicitly call me a liar, then you will name your sources. Tell me precisely, who told you these stories about my alleged behavior?" Jimmy fumbled with his note cards, fingers suddenly clumsy, betraying his composure. He glanced down, then up, then off, camera again, desperately searching for a lifeline. He had not prepared for this. He had never expected resistance. Certainly not like this. "Well, I mean," he stammered, "there have been various reports, industry sources. People who are familiar with the situation. People familiar with the situation," Jennifer repeated slowly. Her tone dripped with derision. "Jimmy, do you hear the words coming out of your own mouth?" The audience was dead silent now. Every breath felt amplified. "You invited me onto your program," she continued, "to execute a character assassination based on phantoms and whispers." She held his gaze, unblinking. "Do you possess any understanding of how profoundly irresponsible that is? Do you grasp the damage that inflicts, not just on me, but on every person who watches this and learns that reputation can be dismantled without evidence?" Jimmy shifted in his seat. The ground beneath him was giving way. This wasn't debate. This was collapse, happening in real time, broadcast live. The studio audience was no longer neutral territory. It had become her fortress. "I have spent decades building trust," Jennifer said, with crews, with collaborators, with audiences. And you thought it acceptable to smear that work using anonymous rumors dressed up as journalism. Jimmy swallowed hard, but instead of doing the only intelligent thing available to you, which would be to retreat, you're pressing forward, she observed calmly, and that tells me everything I need to know. He inhaled sharply, panic now bleeding into irritation. Jennifer, I think you need to calm down, he uttered. The moment the words left his mouth, the very physics of the room seemed to alter. A ripple passed through the audience, audible gasps, hands flew to mouths, somewhere off stage. A producer closed their eyes in defeat. Jennifer leaned back slowly. A smile spread across her face, magnificent, controlled, and utterly terrifying. Did you just tell me to calm down, Jimmy? The room froze. He knew it instantly. The self-inflicted wound, the point of no return, the phrase every woman knew, the one deployed when a man had lost the argument but still wanted authority. I didn't mean, he began. Oh, no. Jennifer interrupted gently. Let's stay right here. She tilted her head, studying him with clinical precision. You've questioned my integrity. You've trafficked in rumors. You've refused to name sources. And now, when confronted, you attempt to delegitimize my response by labeling it emotional. Her smile faded, not into anger, but into something far colder. Jimmy, I am not angry, she said. I am precise. She leaned forward again, voice unwavering. Calm down is what men say when they no longer have facts. It's what they say when the power they assumed was theirs has shifted. Jimmy opened his mouth, but nothing came out. You invited me here believing I would play along. Jennifer continued, smile politely. Absorb the insult. Protect your show. Protect the system. She gestured lightly toward him, but instead you exposed it. She paused, and you exposed yourself. The applause began slowly, one clap then another, until it swelled into something overwhelming. The producers no longer signaled. There was nothing left to salvage. Jimmy sat frozen, nodding mechanically, his face drained of color now. The storm he had tried to summon had consumed him instead. Jennifer turned slightly toward the audience. For the record, she said, holding people accountable is not hysteria. Demanding evidence is not aggression. And refusing to be diminished is not a tantrum. She looked back at Jimmy, its leadership. The applause roared. Jennifer leaned back in her chair, composed, victorious, not because she had raised her voice, but because she never had to. The cameras kept rolling, and somewhere in the control room someone realized they had just captured a moment that would never be forgotten.